Hi and welcome to the New Motorsport Show. As we look ahead to this weekend's Grand Prix of Azerbaijan, we meet McLaren's young superstar Lando Norris as he prepares for Baku. We talk to Dave Beck of Dallara about the dazzling array of cars now being built at their factory near Parma, Italy. Chris Beattie, stylist of the gorgeous 2018 Indy cars, joins us in the studio, and 50 years on from the passing of Jim Clark, Nigel Roebuck remembers the driver who once bashfully accepted a flask of tea from a local fan before going out to win 4 races in one day, as he would. Let's begin, though, with a look back at the Formula One matters of moment from the past week, and specifically the news that Liberty are looking to form a joint venture partnership with a local company in China. All this in the name of expanding the Formula One footprint in China, a country which it has raced since 2004, of course, and thus hopefully unlocking the sponsorship floodgates of the world's biggest, or maybe the second biggest, economy. In this context, it's good to see that Fernando Alonso has just announced a big karting program for the Chinese market, and that there's definitely a talent pool out there for future Chinese drivers in Formula One. Guan Yu Zhao, who has serious family backing and has signed up to the Ferrari Academy, has shown decent pace in FIA Formula 3 with Prema. And last Saturday, a 17-year-old Chinese driver named Yifei Yi won a frantically tight Renault Eurocup race, the third of the season, at Monza. Now in his third year in Europe, having won 2 national karting championships and the 2016 French Formula 4 championship, Ye drives for the blue-chip Joseph Kaufmann race team, and at Monza took the pole before beating all comers, including the 2 Renault Sport Academy drivers, Christian Lundgaard and Max Futrell, who managed to collide on the approach to turn 1. Lundgaard drove well to win race 2, but the star again was Ye. He dropped to 18th after hitting the back of Futrell on lap 4, but recovered to finish an amazing 7th on the road in a damaged car, albeit with a 10-second penalty. Yifei spoke to me on FaceTime after these 2 races from his apartment in Le Mans, France, where he's supported by the French Fédération Sport Automobile, the FFSA, as a result of his win last year in Formula 4.
When I was racing, there were not many competitive championships, and there were not many drivers racing. So after winning the Chinese championship, I moved to Japan for seeking some higher level races. Then I got the success in Japan, so I moved living in France to compete in European karting championship. And after doing some great job, then I moved to single seaters in French Formula 4.
What sort of budget have you been able to generate?
Last year I had some prize money from winning the 2016 Formula 4 French Championship, and this year I just have some small sponsors, but I think this year if I do great, then we will be talking with some good people, also with some teams for the upcoming seasons, to have some great deal for the future.
And how big will the news be in China now after that win in Monza?
I would say it was a blast when everyone was cheering for me, when everyone sent me congratulations from literally all over the cities in China, and I'm very encouraged, and I think it's a very good start for me, and I'll just keep going and do better and better in the future, and prove them that I have the talent, and I can make it to top step.
An amazing talent, a 17-year-old Chinese driver who speaks French and English as well as Mandarin, and who's had the gumption to go out there and get it. If an F1 team doesn't sign him right now, or if Liberty doesn't make it happen, then we might as well close the Shanghai circuit right now. Formula One needs talented Chinese and American drivers, for that matter, even more than it needs more overtaking or more social media. And here we should remember that an equally quick young American named Logan Sargent won the 2nd Eurocup race at Ricard a couple of weeks ago and finished 4th in race 2 at Monza. These new drivers aren't going to fall out of the sky as a result of a joint venture or semi-slick marketing. They're going to play a role in Formula One's future only if they get genuine support when they need it most. It was a strange, make that sad week for Williams F1. Yes, the Advanced Engineering Division won a Queen's Award for innovation, and for the Formula E battery in particular. And yes, some aspects of the company's 2017 statement look half reasonable. Revenues before costs and taxes were slightly up for the Formula One team at £125 million, but overall revenue for the group was down at £166 million. That was nothing, though, compared with the statement Sir Frank Williams' daughter, Claire, made to racefans.com. If Formula One doesn't adopt a budget cap for 2021, she said, then the whole Williams company will close. How's that for giving a positive vibe to current backers and potential sponsors, particularly as a workable budget cap in Formula One is about as likely to happen as a, I don't know, switch to electric cars? All this as Williams reflects on the news that their most experienced driver, Lance Stroll, was 0.3 seconds slower in China this year than he was in 2017, when he was a rookie new to the circuit. In 2017, Stroll finished third in Baku, so there's another benchmark that looms large. A brighter note was struck by Renault Formula One, who announced that they're stepping up their demo runs in the Provence-Côte d'Azur region in the build-up to the French Grand Prix at Le Castellet in July. Fans will see a 2012 V8 Formula One car. You'll remember them, they're the ones that sounded like race cars. Plus lots of hot Renault road cars driven by all the Renault contracted stars. Good stuff, and something all the teams should emulate in my view. Let's have the British teams doing likewise in the weeks before Silverstone. Let's have teams like Haas and Ferrari wowing the crowds in LA and New York in the build-up to Austin. Liberty's Formula One live events are excellent, but the fans need still more access on a regular basis. And these team demo days are the perfect way to bring the fans forward. And more fans mean more sponsors mean a healthier F1. And how about this at Imola last weekend at the first of Riccardo Patresi's motorsport festivals? Great drivers, lovely cars, and lots of chat about Ayrton Senna, of course, May 1 being the anniversary of his passing at this beautiful undulating former Formula One circuit near Bologna. Now, Formula 2 will be on the programme at Baku, which will be a bit of a shell shock for some of the rookies who tested luxuriously before Bahrain, no testing in Azerbaijan. One driver who for sure will be prepared, however, is an 18-year-old rookie by the name of Lando Norris. He won the opening round of the F2 series in Bahrain, heading a Carlin 1-2. I spoke to him at the McLaren Technology Centre in Woking about this and that and what makes him tick as a very fast racing driver at such a young age. Lando, thanks for chatting to us. What a time this is. I don't want to tempt fate in any way, but it's started pretty well the year, right?
So far so good, I must say. Especially on my side of things, F2 started off extremely well. But it's only the start, there's a long season ahead, so...
That's exactly what you said in Formula 3 a year ago.
Yeah, and that turned out perfectly, so hopefully this year can go the same.
But brilliant for you, and also for Carlin too, to have that 1-2. And have a bit of a race with your teammate, race 2. What's going on there?
Yeah, it was fun, especially because Sergio's a very good teammate. We get along very well. He's very hardworking, and I think he's been a big asset to helping the team develop, especially from the start of the season where we had to learn a lot about the car. We've pushed each other a lot, and he's very fast, so it's really helped develop the car and kind of get to the point where we are now and get the 1-2 in race 1. So I think the whole team, and especially Sergio and me, were very happy.
A lot of work went into the new car in terms of the front wing and also the diffuser. What is it like running closely with other cars now with that new aero setup?
I experienced one race in the old car, and it was pretty difficult to follow very closely. Whereas this year, it's slightly better, I think. I don't think we've seen the best tracks for overtaking. I think
and in Bahrain, you were limited anyway with power because of the temperature thing.
Yeah, I think that's just general power, but everyone was in the same boat. So there were still overtakes. Obviously, Markov showed that very much so in race 1. I never followed too many people. Obviously, race 1 I was completely on my own. Race 2, I only followed Sergio, and for a short time, Giotto. So the hardest guy to follow is your teammate, and therefore I couldn't really.
Yeah, so difficult to make an objective judgment.
What
sort of restraints are you putting on yourself, if any, in terms of getting ahead of yourself, keeping everything under control, one step at a time? It must be. I mean, the fans are thinking it must be really difficult at the moment for you.
I tend to not kind of overwhelm myself with anything, basically. I'm just, I'm extremely happy with how the first race weekend of the year went.
It's kind of nice that Baku's so different from Bahrain, because it's something on which you've really got to focus, I would guess.
Yeah, I mean, I've never been there before. I drove today on the sim and yesterday on the sim, so I'm as prepared as I can be, and I probably have been for driving a new circuit, and I think that's obviously very important. But it's very different to most other tracks with the long straights and extremely twisty bits in the middle. So kind of like Macau in some ways.
And Po, you're really good at Po too.
Yeah, I'm Po, so I like this kind of track, so hopefully it can go well.
But it's the sort of circuit which comes alive in race conditions, particularly with safety cars coming in, brakes cooling a little bit, and that turn 1 braking area is quite definitive as well. So it's a race circuit as much as it is anything else.
Very much so. I think in qualifying, obviously, a slipstream and everything will help you get a better position. But
you and Sergio planning to tow one another around, do you think?
Not yet. it could be on the cards. I think a toe in this car helps a lot, even from an extremely long way back, and it helped me already in Bahrain to get pole position. So it's very effective from a long distance. So I'll be aiming to. I think most people probably aim to, but it's whether you can keep the distance and them not intrude your lap in any way. So we'll see when we get there. See after FP1 what we're like. But the racing, as you can see from the past few years, has been extremely good.
What was it like being a part of the Grand Prix weekend, being on the race card, as it were? And how much time were you able to spend with the team, the F1 team?
Well, it was very different, but I tried to not put too much pressure on myself.
Hard not to think about them all watching you.
Yeah, and it was probably like the most pressure I probably was in, especially for like qualifying, because qualifying I'm probably most excited for in a weekend. I really enjoy, putting a whole lap together, or trying to, and having to make it inch perfect.
When you have a bad mood, when things haven't gone right, how do you then race on race day? Are you a different person, different driver?
Well, if I make a mistake, I get annoyed. I get really annoyed with myself. Not so much maybe in a race situation, but qualifying, because you have kind of one attempt. It's generally what I've been pretty good at, and it can be quite a big deciding factor for your whole race, especially in Formula 2.
Yeah.
So,
but what I'm getting at is, when you're annoyed, do you drive better, do you think?
the opposite. When I'm completely relaxed is when I'm driving at my best. And when I'm in the zone, I'm perfectly relaxed in a qualifying situation. That's when I really do a good job. And I get pole by however many tenths or something. But it's when I put pressure on myself and made a mistake in qualifying on the first run, then I get annoyed, and for my second run I have to kind of calm myself down a bit.
Quite a lot of dramas off the line in this first F2 race. The clutch situation, we saw what happened with ART. What was it like for you for that first start?
Perfect.
Yeah, I know it was, but what was it like in the build-up to that? Were there any concerns about how to get it right? How much practice could you do?
We did a fair bit. I think we did, we did probably one of the most out of all the teams. It's obviously a very crucial part of the whole weekend and the whole race. So we focused a lot in Paul Ricard, Magny-Cours, wherever, to try and get starts in, because they're not easy. We have two
Are they
clutches.
more difficult than last year?
I would say they're more difficult, again, in different ways. Last year, we had more torque, so it was very easy to wheel spin.
Right.
And even if you bogged down, you could quite quickly wheel spin again. Whereas with this car, you would release the paddle, to kind of the bite point, then release the other one. And there's an extremely fine line between bogging down, and once you bog down, you're kind of screwed. There's not enough torque to get you going again.
Right.
Or you will spin a lot, like George say, or somehow you get it perfect like I did and just perfectly slip the clutch, so you're not doing either. You're not wheel spinning or bogging. And I think that makes it very difficult. It's very easy to go wrong, but I didn't do enough starts in last year's car to have know enough to see how hard it is, kind of thing.
Are you going to do any other racing apart from F2 now that the season's underway?
I would like to. Le Mans is something I definitely would want to do. Sadly, I don't think it's going to happen. I think the biggest focus is on Formula 2, making sure everything goes to plan on that and not taking any distractions away.
You're getting a bit of a reputation now as a videographer and everything that's going on the video side. No, you are, Lando. People say, wow, have you seen Lando's videos? And that's great. I assume that all was triggered by the whole Ferdinand Habsburg video situation in Macau, and he's leading the field in this area, and you're kind of catching up relatively quickly.
Well, we had it planned for a couple of years ago with We Are Grip. They handle all my media, and they had a plan to do it a long time ago, but we decided it wasn't kind of the right time. There was no point putting pressure on myself and having people around, which I didn't need, basically. And I tend to do better when it's calm, there's no one. I can just sit down, relax, and whatever. So there's no need to have this in such an early point in my career. The Ferdinand video from Macau was a bit of a trigger to kind of, it's a lot of people enjoyed it.
Okay, one final question. Fernando, I'm assuming you get on really well with Fernando.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've had any interaction with other Formula One drivers, just being there in Bahrain and how it went. I mean, did Lewis know who you were, for example? Did you see him? Did you?
I never saw him. I saw him come into the paddock on his scooter.
Did you wave?
Nope.
It would have been an interesting test to see if he'd wave back, actually. That's probably why you didn't wave. But
What, because I didn't think he would wave back
yeah,
at me?
exactly, yeah.
No, I don't know. I think...
Sebastian, Kimi.
No, I didn't. I never spoke to anyone. Stoffel and Fernando.
It's kind of bizarre, isn't it? There you are, all race drivers, all taking part every weekend, and you haven't
Yeah, don't
actually
even see
met
each
these
other.
guys yet.
I've met Sebastian, I met Lewis. I spoke to Sebastian a while ago in the FIA Awards, so he was a really nice guy, a very good guy to talk to, so I have a lot of respect for him. He gave some time away to come and speak to me when I was younger, and for an F1 driver, not many F1 drivers do that, so he was cool, but apart from that, Fernando and
So you're a Sebastian fan? Putting you on the spot now. Or a
Yeah.
Daniel Ricciardo fan? Or putting Fernando to one side, of course.
I'm a fan of a lot of drivers. Sebastian is definitely one of them because not just because of his racing, but because of who he is off track. I know some people don't think he has the greatest attitude off track, and
When you say off track, you mean when behind the safety car? You mean?
he whinges a lot and does whatever. But as a person, when you speak to him, he's very nice.
Yeah.
And yeah, sometimes his kind of on track or radio, whatever, has some consequences. But as a driver, I respect him, and he's an extremely good driver, 4-time world champion.
We haven't really got into Radio Lando yet in terms of what you're saying inside the car. A little bit in F2 coming along. But in those situations like the one he was with Fernando, do you think you're the sort of guy that would say what Sebastian said at that moment? Are you a spur of the moment guy like that?
I don't know, because you have to put the effort into flicking on your radio, then saying it, then flicking it back off again.
Yeah, but you're also thinking, I want Charlie Whiting to hear this so that he knows.
Well, I'm sure he would have seen that. I would shout at myself and probably say, "What an idiot," or something. But
Do you ever shout at yourself in the car for being an idiot?
A lot.
Did you shout out of the last corner in Bahrain in qualifying?
Yeah, there was a lot of swearing going on.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
But you didn't have the button pressed, obviously.
No, I went over the line, and then I was like, I apologised to the team because I thought I kind of messed it all up, didn't get pole. I was like, I'm sorry guys, messed up, probably could have been pole. And then he was like, well, for the moment you're pole, so everything's all right.
The new 2018 IndyCar has come in for much praise around the world because of its looks, because it slides around a little more, and because it seems to generate some very close racing. That's good news, of course, for the Verizon IndyCar series, and could be good news too for Formula One, if it is able to swallow a little bit of pride and learn from the Americans, and the British as it happens. One of the key men behind the new concept is the UK-based styling designer, Chris Beattie. He now joins me in the studio. Well, Chris, fascinated to meet you because it's so unusual to find an industrial designer, ultimately to do with aesthetics, I guess, involved in motorsport, involved in a category of racing, which wants your talent, which wants to make the cars look nice, as distinct from the engineering side of things. Tell us how that's all come about, first of all.
My background, you say, is in design. I launched a concept car called the Velocity a few years ago, which is really a downtime project, just because I wasn't really satisfied with the way racing cars were going in terms of the aesthetic of them and how they were performing. We had Formula One that had very heavy downforce, we had IndyCar that had very heavy downforce, and I wanted to do something that really tipped that on its head.
So proactively you just did this project.
Yeah.
And you did it all online, it all went out on social media, and that's how it all came about,
It
right?
all came about, and it really took off. The concept was called the Velocity. I managed to get involved with Stefan Wilson following his brother's accident in Pocono, which I was actually at when that happened in the States. And he, the next day, had a meeting with IndyCar Safety Department and got my work in front of Jeff Horton, who is the guy that is heading up IndyCar's windshield program. And Jeff got in contact with me and said, "Can we look at doing some concept work on the car, on the windscreen?" So I worked with him to produce concepts that then went off to PPG for approval in terms of the form factor of that screen, to really work out what could and couldn't be done in terms of the material they were using, whether it was going to distort, all that sort of stuff. But also looking at ways that screen could be integrated into the DW12 chassis as it was at the time. And that project sort of finished, I guess, 2 years ago now in terms of my involvement with it. And then I heard that the 2018 project was coming up and asked Jeff really if I could have the contact details for the guy that was running that project, who was Tino Belli, who's the aerodynamic director at IndyCar. So I wrote to him and said, I really want to get on this project. This is perfect. You've got some things going on here that I think I can help with. And kind of got a response back that was very much, it's an aero engineering project. And I thought, well, okay, I've given it a fair crack. We'll see where it goes from there. And about a month later, I got a email back that had the concept as it was at that time. And Tino and Jeff were really asking what I thought of it as a sort of casual observer. So I attacked this thing over a course of a weekend with a biro and Photoshop and said, do this, 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 and this. I sent that back, and the next stage I got sent through was taking into account a lot of those styling items in terms of, it was things like pushing the roll hoop forward to get that lean forward, extending the side pods and leaning that forward, bringing the wings back on the super speedway kit. That kind of visual cue, just to get the car looking faster.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And the cars do look great. How did the interface with Dallara go once that had been established?
Well, basically, I was consulting for IndyCar, so Tino would be interfacing with Dallara. They'd be sending stuff backwards and forwards. I'd be making recommendations, and it would be a to and fro process between myself and Dallara. The guy at Dallara, the in-house stylist there, was a guy called Andrew Guerra. And he's had some touches on the car as well. There's some of his bits and pieces on there. And it was really kind of a team effort between myself, Dallara, and Tino and Bill Pappas at IndyCar to pull the car together.
Congratulations to you and the team, because the cars do look fabulous. And talking to the drivers, we had Rob Wickens on the show not so long ago. He was saying how nice the cars are to drive. 40% less downforce now. Easier to follow cars in front. I think you got some stats actually for... Let's talk about the ease of following another car on an oval. We've had the Phoenix Oval.
So Phoenix Oval, the IndyCar rate their races by a quality statistic, and the statistic for Phoenix last year it was 5.6. This year it was 7.2. And I think that's out of 10, and that's done via various scoring and timing and passing manoeuvres. But the interesting thing has been that the following distance for the cars. So last year they were running into all sorts of trouble with turbulence, and that affected the amount of overtakes.
As they are in Formula One.
Exactly, that's a big problem with single-seater cars at the moment. That this year with the new Aero kit has been halved, which allows the cars to have allows the drivers to have a much better run on the car in front coming into a corner, because they've been much closer coming off the following corner. And I think that's really improved the racing. We saw at St. Pete and Long Beach, the number of overtakes there were in those races has gone up a lot as well. So, for instance, St. Pete, in the top 10 drivers, there was 119 passes in that race, and 11 of those were for the lead. Drivers are reporting that the cars are more lively, more of a handful to drive, which makes them more fun to drive. And it's what we want to see as a fan. That's what I want to see is. To
repeat myself, all credit to you and the team for that. I'm interested to know from a stylist point of view, what do you think is the best view of the Indy car now? 3/4 front, 3/4 rear, rear front? Or is there indeed a view you don't like of the car?
I don't think there's a view I don't like of the car. As a designer, there's always going to be bits you look at and go, oh, maybe we should have done that different, because it's a year down the line now, as far as I'm concerned. I think in the speedway trim, rear 3/4 looks great, because you haven't got the tyre bumpers there anymore. You've got the big fat tyres, and it just looks awesome from that angle. Road course, we've got the big rear wing on there, which I had some involvement on. I think probably the side view of the road course car looks fantastic in terms of that really brings out, you've got the angles of the rear wing, you've got the angle of the side pod and the roll hoop, and they all kind of pull together to make a very aggressive and fast-looking racing car, I think.
The 2018 Indy car is actually built by Dallara, as we say, but so are lots of other race cars too. Formula One with Haas, Formula 3, GP3, the new Formula 2 car, LMP2, and of course the new Gen 2 Formula E's. Dallara's roll of honour just goes on and on and on, as does Gianpaolo Dallara himself. For more, I caught up on FaceTime with Dallara's Dave Beck, asking him initially about the new Formula 2 Aero package and how it's performing in traffic.
One thing that we did put a big push for was for passing, and we had great passing. In fact, a couple of the drivers I interviewed straight after the race, they confirmed that the car does follow well, even in quite high-speed corners. You can get close to the car in front, which is the key to having good passing.
And is that front wing design or more diffuser design?
And it's the whole car. It's the whole car together. Okay, you start with a very wide front wing, which is what we've got, and the diffuser, the whole thing. It's all about the wake out the back of the car. The wake has to be narrow and high and not low and wide, which interferes with the front wing of a trading car. That's simplifying it.
Dave, Dallara building cars for a number of different race categories this year. How's it going? What's the work intensity like there?
We've had a very tough winter this year. People are quite tired in Dallara. There was a lot more work involved in the Haas car this year. For example, the chassis alone took 3 times the man hours to produce. Wow. There's just been a huge push in there. The car's a lot more. I wouldn't say it's a lot more complicated. It's a lot more sophisticated, but they've made it in a fairly simple way, which is the hardest thing to do. You know, but yeah, it's massively more. A huge effort's been put in there, and obviously here at Dallara we've been making the new Formula 2 cars as well, the new Formula E cars we're working on at the moment, the new chassis. We had the new kits for IRL.
And the Haas Formula 1 car is to some extent already justifying all that effort. Did Dallara claim some design input for that car?
Well, yeah, there is, yeah. We can, definitely. It was done in Dallara with the combination of Dallara and Haas engineers together. It's a combined effort.
And they use your tunnel, right?
No, they use mainly the Ferrari tunnel. Our tunnel is used for more the cooling and other bits and pieces,
right?
As more of a backup. But the main tunnel we used was Ferrari. Yes.
The Gen 2 Formula E car looks to be a complicated one to build, bodywork wise.
We started off mainly just doing the chassis, the structure items, the battery box, which is now integrated in the chassis in the new car. And the wings, the nose boxes, and that sort of thing. More of the easier bodywork is farmed out to other suppliers from Spark themselves.
What is Spark's part of the car?
Bodywork, a lot of the superficial bodywork, right? And they were doing some of the suspension, although most of the suspension now, the uprights and the wishbones are made by us as well.
Are they?
It's a big thing. So it was just easy just to use Dallara to do it. So.
Venue for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix is this Hermann Tilke designed street circuit. Unusual in many ways. It's anti-clockwise. We see a few of those on the circuit these days, but worth mentioning. Much more importantly, a very long lap, 3.7 miles. That makes it the second longest circuit in Formula 1. The lap time's way up in the 140 area. And then beyond that, an incredibly long straight by the pits here. Speeds of over 200 miles an hour. Very unusual for a street circuit. Unusual for Formula 1 in general. You can see also at the front here, we're right on the water, so there's a lot of exposure to crosswinds and to winds in general, tailwinds coming onto the straight. There's a big flag right at the end of the lap, which most of the drivers look at to see if there's been any change in wind direction from the lap before. But crosswinds too, and that means we're in Daniel Ricciardo, Lewis Hamilton sort of territory. Anyway, let's have a closer look at turn 1, because this is by far, in my opinion, by far and away the most interesting part of the Baku lap. And it's interesting because it's approached at such high speed and because the circuit narrows on exit. You can see that on the caption there. It's very deceiving for drivers. And then beyond that, if you're offline, bear in mind that the tires may be a little bit cooler than they should be. The brakes will be a little bit cooler because of that long straight. Even worse, if it's a restart, you're really in trouble there. And that's what made Daniel Ricciardo's pass of the 2 Williams at the second restart last year so impressive, that he did that with the tyres and the brakes under temperature. So turn 1, a very interesting part of the circuit. The other point to remember here is there will be a lot of lift and coasting at Baku. It's pretty tough on fuel. And so the drivers, as they approach turn 1 in the race, will be backing off, trying to make the car save fuel just as they go into the braking area. That's not a great thing, some of the fans think. And as a result of that, Formula 1 are changing the fuel regulations for 2019. That's another story. And probably this lift and coasting will go away. But certainly for this year's race, the 2018 race, it will be a lift and coast, defined final third of the race. Worth mentioning here that it is actually the second Azerbaijan Grand Prix, even though we've had 3 on this circuit. The first was the European Grand Prix. If we continue through turn 2, it's kind of relatively straightforward street circuit sort of stuff. The most interesting section of this part is this old city section, very narrow and very precise judgment required of the drivers and very good curb striking from the cars. You can use the curbs here, but they're different from apex to exit, and those exits can jump out at you. As we've seen such drivers as Lewis Hamilton have problems there, many other drivers too. It's a sort of circuit where you'll see debris, we'll see accidents, and therefore we will see safety cars. Beyond that, some very quick corners here. Turn 13 was just flat in qualifying last year, probably will be flat this year, and there's a camber element too. So nice to have those fast corners. And then we're accelerating now towards the seafront again, the harbour front. And this is where it really becomes difficult as a racetrack, because as we saw last year with the dramas with Sebastian Vettel and Lewis Hamilton, when there's a safety car situation, the drivers, or particularly the driver at the front, is going to be doing all he can to get onto the power as soon as possible, because he wants to get those brakes and tyres up to temperature for that run down into turn 1. That's what Lewis did at the first restart in Baku. And guess what? He almost passed the safety car before he got to the timing line, and that would have been disaster for him. So at the second restart, he hung back a lot more, and that's why Sebastian Vettel ran into the back of him. Ferrari, I think, should have anticipated that. They should have learned from what Lewis had done in the first restart, but they didn't. Vettel ran into the back, and then, as we know, got that red mist, and then we had that little bit of road rage, which we kind of don't talk about anymore. But very, very difficult to get the timing right at a restart. This is probably the most crucial part of the circuit, bearing in mind almost certainly we are going to have safety cars. So that's Baku in a nutshell, a difficult street circuit with a long straight. The classier drivers will be thinking rotation and traction. The more aggressive drivers will be thinking brake late, get the power on soon. There'll be differences between the two. The motor racing world lost Jim Clark 50 years ago. The double world champion was killed when a rear tyre deflated on his Formula 2 Lotus 48 at a wet Hockenheim, spinning him into the trees on the outside of the circuit. 7,000 people journeyed to the village of Chirnside, Scotland on the day of his funeral. On the 50th anniversary of those dark times, again in Chirnside and also in Duns, the bigger town nearby, it was easier to smile a little and to put Jim's life into motor racing perspective. He was a self-effacing sheep farmer born with the amazing gift of driving racing cars on the absolute limit. He wasn't in it for the glory, and he definitely didn't want to be a star. What he loved was driving and racing. Driving everything from a saloon car to an F1 car, from a pre-war ERA to an Indy Volstead Ford, and then competing on pieces of road as diverse as the Enlon-Villars hill climb in Switzerland with the Indy-winning Lotus 38, to the Tasman circuit of Terratonga and the NASCAR Oval at Rockingham. We won't see his like again, but we'll never let the aura fade, as Nigel Roebuck explained when he spoke recently to Anthony Rowlandson and me.
I saw Jimmy race first when I was a schoolboy. In fact, lots of times when I was a schoolboy. And it was at Oulton Park, and he was driving an Elite. I was there with my dad, and I can remember clearly my dad saying, "That boy's worth watching." And we were watching at Cascades, and he was going through Cascades, and the most beautiful drifting in the Elite every lap. It was, so. That was my kind of, and we looked at, well, who is it? Number whatever it was. Oh, Jay Clark. You know, and that was when the first time the name kind of registered. And then, well, I mean, yeah, all through my teenage years. I mean, I saw him win the AMG 200 and races like that. And he just quickly emerged as, I mean, Sterling was obviously the man, but obviously the next man was going to be Jimmy Clark. And it's always been a sort of regret to me that we never ever saw Sterling against Jimmy. Because
Brands, 60?
Yeah, there were odd times, there were odd races.
Yeah.
But there were odd races, and Sterling, if you talk to Sterling about him, and Sterling always says that right to the end of his own career, yeah, okay, in equal cars I could beat him, but it was clear even then you didn't want to be against Jimmy Clark in a slightly quicker car. So that was one of the, that would have been one of the great rivalries, wouldn't it?
Oh, undoubtedly.
Two absolute greats, and we were robbed of it, sadly.
And Peter, you grew up watching Jimmy from afar, didn't you?
Well, I did. I grew up in Australia, and in some ways that was a very good thing because I was remote from it all, and so therefore I used to paint these word pictures in my mind as a child of what it was like. and the fodder for those pictures were black and white, smudgy pictures in newspapers and occasional pictures in nice magazines like Sports Car World or Modern Motor at the time in Australia. So I didn't really have any feel for what was going on. There was no television coverage of anything in motorsport at all, even in Australia, let alone overseas. And so I was very, very imaginative, I guess, in the way I saw Formula One. But very early on, Jim Clark captivated me. I can't really describe why, other than to say that the best Christmas present I ever received was on my 10th birthday. My mum and dad gave me Automobile Year, and it was the 62 edition, even though it was 1963. That's how slow things were in Australia then. It took a year for the book to get out there. But there was a shot of Jimmy in that book sitting in the Lotus 25 at the Belgian Grand Prix, the race he won. And it's a big photograph of him, black and white. And he just looks, and it's a terrible word to use in application of Jim Clark, but he just looks so cool sitting in that car. So relaxed and so much the racing driver that I thought, who is this guy? And then a year or so later, his autobiography was published after he won the World Championship. Again, I was a year late buying it, but it's actually the first book I ever bought. I bought it from Swain's bookshop in Pitt Street, I think it was, in Sydney. And I remember it clearly, getting the book, getting it out of its wrapper on the ferry I used to get back to our house in near Manly on the harbour. And opening the book and smelling the pages and feeling the gloss of the cover and going through each page one by one. And I read that book probably 10 times in the space of about 3 weeks. And that changed my life completely. I'd seen Jimmy then successively. I say I was lucky in Australia in some ways because all the Formula One drivers came out to do the Tasman series. So the Clark I got to see was racing until 68 when it was Gold Leaf, but he was racing this beautiful green and yellow Lotus with chromed exhausts under the Australian sun, blue sky, grass paddock area, slight smell of beer in the air, Jimmy no shirt on, shorts, very suntan. That was the Clark I grew up with and knew. And by 68 he kind of recognised me, if that's the right word, but he did, because I went out to the airport to see him off after the Longford race in Tasmania. He flew into Sydney and then on to Indianapolis, where he was going to drive the turbine. He drove both the wedge turbine and the Parnelli car, and his plane was delayed. And he said, "Oh, you're still here? Come and have a coffee." I was with my dad, and the place was empty, and he was with, oddly, one of the stewardesses, one of the flight attendants, as we call them today, and she was there, looking a bit sort of nervous about the whole thing. And he said, "Yeah, come on upstairs." And so we went up, and he's wearing this check shirt and nice slacks, and he had his briefcase with him. And we sat down, and the four of us chatted for about 20 minutes. I mean, it seems incredible today that happened to me. And but I remember saying to Jimmy, I really, really want to get a job in motor racing. I just hate that feeling on Monday morning of going back to school after being at a race meeting. How do I get through that, Jim? I remember saying that to him. And he said, if you really want it badly enough, never ever give up. Whatever you want, you will achieve as long as you never give up. And I said, well, I really want to be a journalist. And he said, don't give up. You will be. And that was basically the last thing, obviously the last thing he said to me. And I was probably the last person ever to speak to him in Australia. I think I was. And sadly, he died a couple of months later, or less than a couple of months later.
So it's a very personal inspiration.
Yeah, and yeah, I've had ups and downs like all of us in life. And whenever it's a down, I always think of that moment when Jimmy said, if you really want it badly enough, never ever give up. And yeah, it's lived with me throughout my life. Jim Clark, for me, therefore became the benchmark around which I judge everything in motorsport. Attitude of drivers, approach of drivers, teams, cars, livery, whatever it is, circuits. I always think, what would Jimmy think here? What would Jim Clark have done there? And he's still the main man for me.
Nigel, do you have quite that idealised notion of Jimmy, or do you see him slightly differently?
No, I can. Everything Peter says, makes complete sense to me. Oddly enough, whenever I think of Jimmy, I mean, I saw Jimmy win a load of races, including the last time he was ever in England in July '67 when he won at Silverstone.
You're all right. Don't go on about it.
Never mind. But oddly enough, if I think of Jimmy, almost always the first meeting that comes back to me is, and in a way, the least likely. And in April of '64, there was a meeting at Oulton Park, and it wasn't even an international meeting; it was a national meeting. And I went, of course, living in the north. never missed a meeting at Oulton when I wasn't at school. Jimmy was down to drive the then new Lotus 30, which he practiced and it broke, which is probably a mercy. But there was a fellow called George Pitt who used to race in those days, who had an old Lotus 19. And he said to Jimmy, well, do you want to drive, can you imagine this? And Jimmy said, yeah. Now I'm stressing to you, this is a national meeting. It was in April. It was a freezing, freezing day. And there is Jim Clark, reigning world champion, taking part. And I seem to think, I think there was also it was almost certainly a touring car race that day as well, and we'd be driving the Lotus Cortina. So I got there on race day quite early in the morning and went into the paddock, because of course, in those halcyon days, you could pay £1 or whatever and buy a pass.
A nice pass, a little cardboard pass on a piece of string,
that's right.
A real pass.
Even at the Grand Prix you could do that, so walked into the paddock, and of course the other thing was that there was nowhere for drivers to hide in those days. There weren't any motorhomes, there weren't even any caravans in those days. And I walked into the paddock, and about the first thing I saw was the reigning world champion standing there, wearing his cardigan. You remember the famous cardigan that he quite often used to wear to drive, didn't he, sometimes? Under a big anorak. And it was bitterly cold. And he was just standing in the middle of the paddock talking to some fans, as they did. But I remember, and these fans were obviously quite overwhelmed by the fact they were talking to Jimmy Clark, and why not? And a lady there, I remember they were, I don't know where they were from. They were clearly from Yorkshire, I think. But I do remember her saying, "Do you know, Jim, would you like some tea?" I remember that clearly. And Jimmy said, "Oh, yeah. And so this woman produces from her bag a flask, unscrews the top, pours tea into it, hands Jimmy and this utterly surreal. And I stood there, I was spellbound by him, and I was just, Jimmy Clark, this is Jimmy Clark. And that was actually, oddly, Peter, that was the one day, I only ever got Jimmy's autograph once, and it was that day at that time. But I couldn't quite believe this is the greatest driver on earth, and I'm standing here with 3 other people on a freezing cold Saturday morning in Cheshire, and nobody else is around. Why isn't everybody here to listen to what he's got to say?
Wonderful memories from Nigel, and you can read more from that interview in the latest edition of F1 Racing. Meanwhile, this was the scene a couple of weeks ago when they remembered Jim up in Scotland.
I think Jim was later in his career. He has such confidence in what, all of us regarded as Colin Chapman's genius, that he somehow felt that he was going to overcome this reputation for Lotus cars being fragile. And I think as time went on, he realised that time was sort of running out. And it wasn't a nervousness. Jim was ice cold, not nervous in a racing car, even though he had this reputation for being indecisive in other things. He had total confidence that somehow he was going to overcome all these problems, because he knew by that time that he was a genius at the wheel. He could cope with any difficulty or any problem that seemed to happen. And of course, in the end, deflating tyre was one time he just couldn't cope with it, and it went off.
The big Jim Clark fan, lived in Scotland, in Aberdeen, for the last 14 years. Moved here for work and working in the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, it's pretty cool to see so many people turn out to recognise the great achievements of Jim Clark, and obviously being from Duns myself, it's good to have the Border Reaver stickers on the car and on my suit and on my helmet, and yeah, it's great to have the name still going and racing and still up at the front hopefully. And yeah, I mean, Dad carried the name on for ages racing in Scotland, and he passed it on to me when I started racing, and the ambition is to eventually keep the name going, hopefully take it back to Le Mans or maybe back across to America. And yeah, that's the plan. We'll see how this season goes, and hopefully.
MotoGP captured Austin, Texas last weekend with a stunning display of balance and acrobatics, but again it was Marc Marquez who reigned supreme. Having been demoted to 4th place on the grid from pole for blocking Maverick Vinales in qualifying, Autosport reports that Marquez leapt to second to turn 1 as Andrea Iannone took the lead. Iannone was able to stick close enough to Marquez to have a go at the Honda rider, but at turn 11 on lap 3 he ran wide and was repassed by the reigning champion on the exit of the corner. Marquez proved unstoppable from that point on, opening a 2-second advantage by the end of the 5th lap and doubling that margin thereafter. His lead peaked at around 7 seconds and he controlled the gap to take his first win of the 2018 season and his 12th straight triumph on American soil by 3.5 seconds from Maverick Vinales and Iannone. Harrison Scott, one of last year's Autosport Young Driver nominees, finished second in the first Pro Mazda race in Alabama, just over 5 seconds behind the very talented Canadian Parker Thompson, and then reversing the honours in the wet on Sunday, scoring his first win after dominating the Euro Formula Open Championship last year with the Italian RP Motorsport team. RP moved to the States with Harrison this year, so this was a win for the new guys. And the very talented Kyle Busch, who once thought about racing in Europe, even in Formula One, won his 3rd straight Monster Energy NASCAR Cup race for Joe Gibbs at Richmond last weekend, beating Chase Elliott, son of Bill, after starting, wait for it, 32nd on the grid. It was a big night for the fans too, this being the 10th anniversary of Busch's infamous clash at Richmond with the much-loved Dale Earnhardt Jr., the one where Kyle, in perpetuity, became the driver that, in that corner of the world, everyone seems to love to hate. Next on the NASCAR trail, the 2.6 mile, steeply banked, ultra-quick Talladega Tri-Oval Superspeedway. Can't wait. Finally, the Fittipaldi name continues to grow ever stronger. Again, Pietro, the 2017 Formula V8 3.5 champion, has rides this year in IndyCar, LMP1 and Japanese Super Formula, the first round of which was won last Sunday by Naoki Yamamoto. And last weekend, his younger brother, Enzo, won 2 of the 3 Italian Formula 4 races in Adria, Italy. Good stuff. That's all for this week's show. We'll be back next week with our full analysis of the race in Baku, including our 3D animations and special guests Alan Gow, Matt Bishop and Craig Scarborough. And we catch up with Trevor Carlin, the prolifically successful team owner who this year is running cars in Formula 2, IndyCar, Indy Lights, FIA Formula 3, Euro Formula Open, British Formula 3 and British Formula 4. See you then.